Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulina Muhammad al-Amin. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to this discussion that we've been having and that we are now nearing the conclusion of. We have been talking for the last several sessions about the ideas related to religion and state that Javed Ahmed Ghamidi has put forward as a counter-narrative to the traditional narrative that exists on the topic within Islamic scholarship and among Muslim scholars and the broader population. So we have been discussing up to this point the 10 points that make up the sort of core of this counter-narrative that Javed Ghamidi has put forward. And the last session, we talked about points 6 and 7, which were related to jihad. And in some, these ideas on jihad were simply, according to Ghamidi, that jihad is against oppression and tyranny. It's not with regard to sort of the expansion of territory or conquering, or even from the standpoint of sort of the way it's crafted and framed in this day and age as a holy war. It's like, that's none of it. It is against oppression and tyranny that originally within the Quran was spoken about in the context of religious persecution, but by extension is other types of oppression and tyranny and standing essentially up for the oppressed. It is also a directive within the Islamic faith that jihad is a religious directive and that this directive is given to Muslims in their collective capacity, right? Not in their individual capacity, but in their collective capacity. And that's an important thing to know. And when we say collective capacity, it's with regard, it is then sort of administered and regulated by those individuals who have been put in charge of the Muslim community by the community itself. They're representatives. They're the people who are governing over them. Okay. In addition to that, so that's you're looking at those two things as point number 6. Point number 7 of the counter-narrative for Ghamidi Saab is the notion that all ethical limits must be followed in the undertaking of jihad. All ethical limits. And among them, the sort of most important ones as they relate to the prohibition of killing innocents, and more specifically, or explaining this further, the notion that you can only fight combatants, only fight people on the battlefield who have raised up weapons against you. And so this dismisses the notion that, just simply because someone is paying taxes in a particular country and then funding that army as a result, that they are somehow legitimate targets. Under Islamic law, according to Ghamidi Saab, as the narrative that he's putting forward is, no, that is completely baseless. There's no basis in Islam for making those people combatants simply because of their role in paying taxes. For instance, you have to be a combatant in order to be a legitimate target in warfare. Okay, we get to the 8th point. The 8th point in the counter-narrative, and there are 10 total, so we have 3 to go. The 8th point in the counter-narrative relates to the idea of democracy. In the traditional narrative, the position of the scholars is that, look, this thing, democracy, it exists. It's an unwanted development in sort of human history. It's here, and now we have to deal with it. That's kind of the posture that the traditional narrative has with regard to democracy. And to some degree, it might make sense given kind of traditional narratives' emergence and development through a period, the majority period of kind of Islamic history, which was the age of empire. And so democracy is viewed in this kind of way. They do not, even sort of groups today, say these folks who are promoting the traditional narrative do not actually accept the idea of democracy in principle. They don't accept it in principle, right? In fact, in Ghamdi's view, even those groups, those religiously inclined groups that are seen to struggle for democracy or are setting up political parties to participate in democracy or towards the end of establishing democracy, that in actuality, they really just see democracy as a means to an end. They're not necessarily valuing democracy itself, but seeing it as something that can get them to particular objectives. In Ghamdi's view, they have not really opened their heart to democracy. He says it just serves a purpose for them. Now, certainly, he says there are going to be some who have opened their hearts, some among these folks who have opened their hearts to democracy or the idea, the principle of democracy, but he thinks that these are very few, or not as many as one would imagine. Right? But he says, actually, centuries before democracy was developed in its current form in the West, and not necessarily in its current form, but it sort of originated in the West and then developed subsequently, that for Ghamidi, although we think that this idea originates in the West, he's not necessarily saying that it originates in the Quran, but we find actually the key kernel of democracy in the Quran itself. That the Quran declares, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, right? That the affairs of the Muslim collective are determined by consultation amongst themselves, right? Their affairs are through consultation, right? That occurs in the Quran. Amruhum Shura Bainahum. And these three words, he says, these three words, what do they mean, right? He says they're quite remarkable, miraculous even, or indicative of the kind of miraculous nature of the Quranic language, that in these three words, an entire idea is conveyed. So what is it that these words mean? What he says they mean is that the collective system governing over Muslims, right? The collective system that governs over Muslims is neither based on the will of any one person, nor on any family, nor through the coercion of the gun, right? In fact, and by coercion of the gun, you mean by sort of military might. Right? None of these things, the collective system governing over Muslims, is not based on any of these things or anything similar to that. In fact, God is saying even He will not intervene with regard to the affairs of Muslims. They will be based on the views of Muslims, right? They have to form their own governing system. What does it mean that God will not intervene? In other words, in the Quran, God is not laying out an elaborate system of governance that has to be put in place in every era where Muslims exist. What God does in the Quran, Ghamidi Sahib says, is lays out directives for those who wish to establish a Muslim government, that if you're going to establish it, it has to abide by certain principles. And a baseline key principle is this idea that the affairs of state must be done through consultation. To this degree, Ghamidi sort of says, look, the reality is, and the truth of the matter is, that in this world, governance can only occur through two means. Either God decides that someone should be made the ruler, right? Or we get together and decide collectively who should rule. Those are really the only two legitimate means by which governance happens. In the first case, where God is deciding who rules, the last time that this decision was made by God, Ghamidi says, was in the case of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that avenue is no longer present. It's closed. Hence, only the second avenue remains. It's the only avenue that we can accept logically and intellectually, and frankly, which we are compelled to accept because we do have a need to establish some type of governing entity. We have to establish this governing entity because of the potential for anarchy and our need to help the oppressed. Otherwise, he says, really for the human being, there's no particular interest that they have in earning money, then paying taxes to support a government that has the potential to transgress against us, right? That doesn't sort of logically make sense unless there's some necessity, some need that we have to put this sort of system or some kind of governing system in place. The governing authority, Ghamidi Sahib says, is a necessary evil that we accept in order to achieve some valuable objectives, right? In Ghamdi's view, as a result, there is, just to reiterate, there is no religious basis for saying that it is the right of a particular person or family or group within society, whether they be religious scholars or whoever, to appoint a ruler. The principle declared by God is simply that the collective affairs of Muslims are on the basis of mutual consultation. And that mutual consultation involves everybody, not simply just the religious scholars or just one family or just one person, right? It is mutual consultation of the Muslim community. So the following can be inferred from this principle, according to Ghamdi. What can be inferred from this is that any Muslim government that gets established should be done through consultation. That the system of governance that is going to be in place, that is also going to be determined through consultation. That everyone has equal rights in offering their consultation. Rich or poor, scholar or non-scholar, they all have equal rights in putting forward their consultation as to what system is going to govern over their lives. Every individual's opinion will be part of the consultative process. Whatever is brought into consultation can be dismantled by consultation. You might agree to something through consultation and then collectively agree through consultation that we should do away with that. That is also possible. But it is not possible that something comes together through consultation and then there's a unilateral decision by a ruler to get rid of it. Right? That is what Ghamdi is essentially saying cannot exist. If he says a decision is not reached through some kind of consensus or agreement, then in that case, a majority opinion can be accepted. Right? A majority opinion, that the majority in their consultations have arrived at this point. And this, of course, makes sense, right? Because you're not going to be able to establish consensus all the time. And if you limit it to just consensus, then the functioning of government essentially could come to a standstill. All of this, if for those who want greater detail on this, Ghamdi Sahib explains in sort of copious detail in his book Meezan, and should look at those chapters. But in his view, the elements that he has described that are derived from the verse with regard to consultation, this is precisely what democracy is. That this is at the heart of what democracy is. As a result, the idea of dictatorship, a dictatorship or authoritarian rule, whether by a family or a group or even some national institution, and he uses this word very specifically, a national institution, because what he's talking about is the military most often, right? But it could be in other cases, other institutions, right? That dictatorship, whether by a family, whether by a group, whether by some type of institution in a society, all of these dictatorships are problematic, Islamically. A dictatorship premised on family is essentially how monarchies are created. Sometimes even under the banner of democracy, monarchies are created, right? Or there could be a dictatorship of a particular group, such as the scholarly class. For instance, in Iran, there's a dictatorship of the religious scholars there. Or of an institution like the army, which has the power of the gun behind it. Dictatorships, Ghamdi Sahib says, cannot be accepted under any circumstances. Even when it comes to explaining religious directives that pertain to society, even when it comes to explaining religious directives pertaining to society, the dictatorship of religious scholars, the experts with regard to these religious directives, a dictatorship of them cannot be accepted either. Right? In these type of directives pertaining to society, religious scholars are the ones who are going to explain and elaborate on them for legislative purposes. Right? That's what they're going to do. They are the experts. They have to do that. That's what they're going to do. They're going to explain, they're going to elaborate. However, their opinion is not just going to be accepted because they gave it. Right? the representatives of the people within sort of legislature do not have to just accept the opinion because the scholars have given it. The decision on whether to accept or not is by the elective representatives of the people, right? Their decision whether to accept an opinion or reject an opinion. And there won't just be one, there'll be many opinions, right? A religious scholar, maybe as a group, occasionally they'll give you just one opinion, but oftentimes you'll have multiple opinions from religious scholars, right? Deciding between them, the process of deciding which opinion is going to be adopted is not a decision for religious scholars to make. It is the decision for the representatives of the people, those who represent the consultative process. This is why Ghamidi has explained this point, a point upon which even Allama Iqbal was particularly perplexed. The idea was that the right of ijtihad, right, of sort of reasoned thinking or sort of elaboration with regard to the faith, was one that traditionally belonged to scholars who were known as mujtahids, right? People who had this ability, based on their knowledge of the sources, to be able to extrapolate from that new rules with regard to society. So the thing that perplexed Iqbal, and the question that kind of raises, is this sort of right of ijtihad that existed with the mujtahid, does it now exist with Parliament? Is Parliament going to be doing ijtihad? And the challenge that comes up is, how can that be? Parliament is going to be composed oftentimes of people who are uninformed about these matters, right? Who are not experts with regard to these matters of religious sort of scholarship, etc. Oftentimes they don't even know what ijtihad is, let alone how to perform it, how to do it correctly. But what Ghamidi says is that there's no need to be perplexed about this, right? Parliament is not going to be doing ijtihad. What Parliament is actually doing is adopting an ijtihad, one ijtihad that has come forward from religious experts on a particular matter, and then making law from there. Their job of Parliament is not to produce ijtihad, but to decide which ijtihad they wish to adopt. And this is something, Ghamidi says, that the average person is doing in their life all the time. The average person might be exposed to Abu Hanifa's way, or Imam Malik's way, or Imam Shafi's way, and then has to decide which one to follow. And they have a right, to sort of make that decision. That resides with them individually. Right? So in our personal lives, we decide which opinion to adopt. In our collective lives, our political representatives make this decision, right? And even in our personal lives, I'm saying we don't have the right to sort of begin assessing an expert's expertise and etc. You're simply just deciding whether to accept or reject the opinion offered, right? And that's the case in our collective lives. All religious scholars will do is put forward an opinion, and they have the right to offer their expertise on their matters, right? But their opinion is not obligatory to follow, right? It's only obligatory to follow when the majority of the people's representatives accept that opinion. This is the purpose of having a parliament or a Congress. Hence, when the Quran says that their affairs will be decided by consultation, there's no restriction placed on whose consultation. There's nothing that says that it must only be pious people or educated people, right? There's no such restriction that exists, nor can it, right? Educated people should perform their duty to inform the masses, educate the masses as to what they think is the right opinion, right? If the common man accepts the education, great, your work is done. If they don't accept it, your jurisdiction is over. You've gone as far as you can go. You're not simply able to force them into some opinion, right? So what Ghamidi is laying out is the limits here with regard to authority, that in fact we are on fairly equal ground. And this, he says, was a key mistake made by our ancient thinkers. What he's speaking about here are people like Plato and Aristotle, who started dreaming of the rule of philosophers, the philosopher kings. Ghamidi says this kind of dream is not possible. A government, he reiterates, can only be established in two natural ways, two organic ways. One is that God appoints it, there's some kind of divine appointment, or people choose it. And another thing to bear in mind, he says, is the government will be a reflection of the people. However the people are, that is how the government will be. If people have moral values, then those will transfer into the government as well. If people are better educated, then the government will be better educated. Governments are simply a reflection of the people. And it's not possible for the government to be anything beyond this. The final authority within the state for Ghamidi is the parliament itself. It's not that of the mujtahid, not that of someone like Abu Hanifa, if he was present today, not that of Ghamidi, nothing. It is that parliament, the sort of representatives of the people that the people have chosen. Even if, he says, jurists unanimously form an opinion with regard to some societal directive, they do not have the authority to force people to follow it. They can only share that opinion, and then it's up to Parliament to decide whether to accept or reject it. The same holds true, for instance, if all the legal experts come to some conclusion, or experts from any other field, economics, etc., come to some conclusion. What they can do is place their opinion before the Parliament, and only Parliament has the authority to accept or reject it. And once it's accepted, then it becomes law. Prior to that, it's just a scholarly opinion. And everyone has a right to present their scholarly opinion. People have the right to critique a decision by Parliament and to make clear to them what mistakes might be there. All right? And Ghamidi says this because he brings up a common question that arises, is what if Parliament makes an incorrect decision and enacts a wrong law? Right? The only way, he says, this happens is if people voting in Parliament have agreed upon accepting this decision, some decision, right? If that's the case, if there's some wrong law that's come into place that people that have only come along because, as he described, there's some opinion that was offered and then Parliament accepted it, the question then becomes, why did Parliament accept that opinion? And so you can critique that opinion that was accepted, you can point out the mistake there, you can present the correct opinion, right? It could be that you think Parliament has made a ridiculous decision, an incredibly wrong decision. You can critique it. You can try to transform it. You can try to persuade people of your position. But if a law is passed based on that decision, then you have to suffer. Now, we're not speaking about here, and Ghamidi is not speaking about laws that then potentially violate or go to the extent of creating sort of violations of people's rights, of transgressing people's honor, etc. Right? That's a separate matter, and there's sort of separate considerations there. But in Ghamidi's view, what is important to bear in mind here is that neither religious scholars, nor judges, nor other institutions are higher than the Parliament here, because the Parliament are the chosen representatives of the people, and so then are the best representatives of that consultative process that the Quran requires. All of this he's deriving from Amruhum Shura Bainahum. So despite any difference you might have with a parliamentary decision, in practice, you have to follow that decision. You have the right to disagree. You have the right to make your disagreement known. That is democracy. In Islam, for Ghamidi then, the only permissible way of establishing and running a government is the democratic way. If any other way is chosen to set up governments, it's going to be illegal, whether it's done by someone who has, as Ghamidi puts it, the glistening prayer mark on their forehead, indicating how pious they are, or even someone who has been bestowed with the title of Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? Even someone who says, hey, my opinion has to be followed. I've never missed tahajjud prayer. Right? Your piety has no bearing there. The only permissible way of establishing and running a government is through this democratic way, through a way that involves consultation, mutual consultation. Dictatorship is not accepted regardless of how pious the dictator may be. In this instance, interestingly, Ghamidi discusses the debate that kind of existed with regard to when America came and ended the Taliban's rule. Right? Now, obviously, when Ghamidi was giving these lectures, 2015, the Taliban had not come back in power, which they are now. But he was speaking about sort of that state of affairs where after 9/11, America had come in and America had ended the Taliban's rule. And he says some of his close friends, some close scholarly friends and other scholars as well, argued that the Taliban have the right to resist the onslaught of the Americans. To which Ghamidi asked, so this means that you consider the Taliban government to be a legitimate one? Now, Ghamdi's view, if that government had come about through the will of the Afghan people, then it would have been a legitimate government. Otherwise, it was nothing more than an illegitimate government that had usurped political power. An oppressive government, if you will. So then the state of affairs, when America is intervening, is an illegitimate government has been brought to an end by an illegitimate intervention, right? What's my interest in kind of intervening here, right? There's just illegitimate government brought to an end by illegitimate intervention. Even today, or at that time, he said the debate was that the Taliban have a right in Afghanistan, right? And should be brought to the table. Dialogue should exist with them. They should be a part of the government. They should be included in the system. And what Ghamidi is fundamentally raising is, on what basis? On what basis? Do they have that right because they were given it to it by an expression of the will of the Afghan people? That hadn't occurred. There were no elections. There was no process by which they came into power. They seized power. Right? They seized power now. They've seized power in the past. For Ghamidi, this is not the manner in which things are done in Islam, or frankly in the world. The Afghan people should be given the right to choose their government, and the Taliban have the right to present themselves as candidates to be chosen. If people elect them, then the question of their legitimacy is moot. But this entire discussion that occurred back in 2015 and even prior to that ignores the basic principle around consultation, will of the people. And he says Pakistan's position should be the same, that the government that's formed in Afghanistan should be formed by the will of the Afghan people. That is what the position of Pakistan should be, because he says, look, if that is what we are demanding, self-determination in Kashmir, that Kashmir and its affairs should be by the will of the Kashmiri people. If they want to stay, stay. If they want to leave, leave. If they want, it should be the Kashmiri people. We should demand the same thing in Afghanistan. Right? The entire purpose of democracy is to settle differences between people. And this principle is one that the Quran has as well. The modern world happens to have it, but the Quran also has this idea of mutual consultation to figure out the affairs of state. We should ask people, Ghamidi says, what they want. We should consider the will of the people. And he talks about this as it relates to Balochistan and other parts of even Pakistan or other parts of the world. If disgruntled people in a particular area of the country want to separate, then ask them. Do a referendum. Do something. There's no need for military action. Any type of action like that wishes to suppress the will of the people or the expression of that will is against fundamental, basic democratic principle. And if you reject this kind of democratic principle, if you reject the idea that consultation and consulting and figuring out the will of the people, and if you reject that principle, then all that's left is coercion and the gun. And any dispute, he says, that's settled by the gun will not be based on knowledge, will not be based on reason, and will have detrimental consequences. So that right there is the 8th point with regard to democracy and the notion that the affairs of the Muslim collective are through mutual consultation. That at the core level, this is fundamental, and all the things that are derived from that are fundamental when we think about Muslim governance and we think about the relationship between religion and state. In the next session, we'll hopefully step into the 9th and final, and then potentially even the 10th point before we conclude these lectures. Walhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah.